On this edition of Independent Sources, Fighting Mainstream, why Al Jazeera is becoming a force in international news coverage despite resistance from American cable carriers. And the end of Black Hollywood. Fort Greene, Brooklyn loses many of its black businesses and becomes one of the most gentrified neighborhoods in the country. Welcome to Independent Sources. I'm Gary Pierre. My co-host Vienna Venka is out this week. There's been a lot made of Time Warner Cable's decision to drop Current TV from its list of channels after Al Jazeera purchased the company from its founder, former Vice President Al Gore. Some observers have speculated that the decision was made in light of some negative press that the Qatari company received during George W. Bush's administration. It's been a hard image to shake, despite the network's internationally recognized awards for its coverage of the Arab Spring. That led many observers to say that rather than hurting the news, Al Jazeera may be helping. With that in mind, we decided to revisit an interview I conducted with Omoyele Sowore of the online news publication Sahara Reporters and Kristen Salumi of Al Jazeera English. We talk about how the company may actually be setting new standards for international news reporting. Since 2005, there's been about 8 networks launched in the United States from foreign countries. We have one from China, Colombia, Russia, and so on. What's behind this proliferation of networks coming in this country?
Well, I can only speak to Al Jazeera's experience and the demand for foreign reporting, which we've seen increase recently with all of the major news stories that are happening in the world, whether it's a nuclear crisis in Japan or revolution spreading across the Middle East and North Africa. I think people are realizing that what happens in the rest of the world, Americans are realizing that what happens in the rest of the world really has an impact on them at home. And perhaps the American networks and the Western networks aren't always able to cover those stories with as much authority as networks that are elsewhere or positioned elsewhere in the world. And so with the increasingly global world that we live in and these very important stories happening, there's an appetite to find out what's going on in the rest of the world that Western networks aren't always feeding.
Omoyele, this is happening at a time when American networks are cutting back their foreign coverage. What are the consequences globally or for America specifically?
I wanted to say quickly that when 2001 happened, the World Trade Center attacks, America, a huge percentage of America was welcome to the world. And the first thing everybody regretted was that they knew little about the rest of the world because, like I usually say, even when they are playing baseball games in New York City between 2 games, they call it a World Series. But the world was beyond here, and that was where the demand began for news from other perspectives. And of course, like Hillary Clinton said, America's media had become such a joke that it was no longer news, it was plastic surgery, and of course, talking heads. So by the time America went to war, Americans wanted to see the information from the other part of the world. And of course, it was also at the time that the American media was struggling in terms of ability to cover events all over the world. So they had no option than to open up the gates of information to flow both ways, because it used to be a one-way traffic before. It was a natural order of things, because at that time also, the world order had changed quietly.
But to the point that American networks are cutting back, what implications are there for American U.S. news consumers?
Well, they were cutting back, but that does not stop the demand for news. And that's why you saw that America was forced to accept that, of course, other people could read news better than they could do, or that they could accept information from other sides of the world or from the other part of the world coming this way. And lastly, I also think that it was the fact that geographically, in terms of population, the immigration over the years in this country has changed, and the fact that everybody in America wasn't an American anymore to the core meant that Nigerians, Chinese people, the people from the Middle East that were living in the U.S. wanted also to have information coming their way from the sources they could trust, because America also lost, alongside this period of time I'm describing, trust of the consumer of news.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Al Jazeera, because despite all this demand that's out there for a different perspective, Al Jazeera has been having a hard time getting on the airwaves here. Why?
Well, I think there are many reasons, but the one reason that Al Jazeera hears when it approaches cable companies and broadcasters in the United States is that there just isn't a demand, there isn't an appetite for international news. We've argued quite the contrary in the examples that I just gave, particularly what's happening in the Middle East and North Africa right now. Al Jazeera saw its web traffic increase 2,500% during the revolutions in Egypt, during the pro-democracy movement in Egypt. 2,500%, that's amazing.
But still, what's the problem with carrying it on a network? Because obviously we've established that people are interested in this. There's U.S. Foreign policy implications here. So what's the matter with Al Jazeera, which is owned by the Emir of Qatar, if I'm not mistaken, right?
That's right.
Okay.
Again, what they tell us is we don't have this demand, and also that we don't have a lot of room on our cable platforms. We have limited room, and it's in the end it's a business decision where they think they're going to make the most money.
Now, many of these networks that we're discussing here are government-owned. Does that change the quality of the news that is being consumed here?
I don't think so. I think if you look at Al Jazeera, you look at Press TV.
That's a French TV?
I mean, Press TV, which comes out of Iran, by the way. What you're seeing is not a government that had control over news as such. It was a government who wanted their own side of the story to be heard. And because of that, they opened up, the information space to, like, say you need, Press TV could cover a little bit of protest. But Press TV knows that if they don't cover a protest in Iran, it will be covered by Al Jazeera. So it was useless and needless to hold on tight to control of the kind of information that is coming out to the rest of the world. But one thing I consistently wondered was why Al Jazeera was not given a platform here. But it's not only a business decision, it's also a proprietary decision that the Americans or the American media or the government still wants to control the kind of information that people see about America. They don't want, for example, Al Jazeera to report that soldiers are dying in Iraq or Afghanistan when they want the networks in the evening to show that people are getting flowers on the streets of those countries where they are fighting wars. So that is, but nobody could hold it anymore. Like I said, you turn the world into a global village. You couldn't lock people in the village up in their houses. They need information, they will look for it. Either Al Jazeera is on TV or not, people are getting it. I mean, look at the web. You can get the same quality of TV from the web as you can, and Al Jazeera is on live station. You pay $5, you get it 24/7, the same way you get it on TV.
Do you think that this is doing a disservice to American news consumers to be blocking Al Jazeera?
Absolutely. Americans need to know what's going on in the rest of the world, even in parts of the world where American policy may be unpopular. One misconception about Al Jazeera, one question we get asked a lot is, isn't there a bias against Israel? Isn't it, since Al Jazeera originates in the Middle East, isn't there some bias? Al Jazeera has a policy of showing both sides of the story. We have a code of ethics that we follow. And what many people don't realize is that Israel has long broadcast Al Jazeera and put its officials to speak on Al Jazeera, knowing that it needed to get its message out to the rest of the world and also to educate its own citizens about how the rest of the world is seeing Israel. And I would argue that the United States has the same needs, and the American media should have the same responsibility to let the American citizens know what is happening.
Is this the end of CNN as we know it, as the global news leader?
It's not about the end of the CNN. That reign, has passed a long time ago. That's the truth. Because what you'd have seen in North Africa, for example, in those places where revolutions were happening, was that the American media almost entirely failed to cover the Tunisian revolution because the CNN is no longer a global leader. They couldn't get there on time. But Al Jazeera was there. They rushed to Egypt, but because of the contradictions of their broadcasts in the past, people were hushing them around in Egypt. The government of Egypt was the enemy of the American media. The people couldn't trust the American media, and who do we have to rely on? Al Jazeera and citizen journalism. The global leader today is citizen journalism. It's not even Al Jazeera, and that's the part that I belong to.
So what's next for Al Jazeera? Do you think anytime soon we'll be able to see it on local?
We are hoping and fighting for that to happen. There's a campaign that the network has launched on our website called Demand AJE that encourages people to write to their local cable companies and ask for us. We've gotten more than 60,000 emails through that since launching it, and we're encouraging people to do more, and we are actively promoting our name and the great journalism, award-winning journalism that we do. You can tell I'm a bit biased on the subject.
A little bit.
Yeah. But so hopefully that will make a difference.
Well, thank you for this wonderful conversation. Omoyele Sowore, Christian Salome, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Still to come on the show, where have Black-owned businesses gone in Fort Greene, Brooklyn? Before that, Abi Ishola has some other news.
Thanks, Gary. Here's a look at some headlines from the ethnic and community media. From El Diario La Prensa, some public housing residents are calling on the city to get rid of mold in their homes. 8 New Yorkers from different housing projects in the Bronx, Brooklyn, and Manhattan mailed letters to the New York City Housing Authority and the mayor's office to remove the asthma attack-inducing substance from their apartments. Asthma is recognized as a disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act, so the tenants argue that the Housing Authority should provide better housing for them. The problem with mold got especially worse throughout the city after Hurricane Sandy. One Irish group is petitioning for the United States to make St. Patrick's Day a national holiday. Irish Central reports that the Ancient Order of the Hibernians, or AOH, says the Irish holiday would show Americans how important Irish immigrants are in the U.S. Jimmy O'Halloran, president of the AOH, says he hopes to get the petition on President Obama's desk in time for the next St. Patrick's Day. From Clutch Magazine, a new study finds that Black children perform better academically when they are taught Black culture and racial pride. Ming Tay of the University of Pittsburgh and James P. Hughley of Harvard University surveyed 630 adolescents from middle-class backgrounds to find out how racial discrimination affected their GPA, educational goals, and future aspirations. They found that when parents promote feelings of pride and racial knowledge, it offsets the negative impact of racial discrimination on a child's academic development. The French Institute, Alliance Française, is expanding its reach to the East Village and Carroll Gardens, Brooklyn. France Amérique reports that the organization will open new centers in each neighborhood offering French language classes for adults. Florence Leclerc, FIAF's vice president, says each location is more accessible for New Yorkers to learn French. And finally, In the Heights is heading to Washington Heights. Manhattan Times reports that the Tony Award-winning musical will reunite on stage in the neighborhood that inspired the play. The production originally made a successful run on Broadway from 2008 to 2011. The reunion will happen for one night, February 11th, at the United Palace Theater. That's a look at some stories from the ethnic and community media.
My name's Reggie. Just recently, my wife and I took in her sister's children. Now, we already had 4, so I went from becoming a family man to a man with a bigger family. Now, you can't eat love, so I don't know how I'm gonna feed them tonight. How was that, Rich?
I think I look more like Denzel.
That's cold, man.
Play a role in ending hunger. Visit feedingamerica.org/hunger and find your local food bank.
Fort Greene, Brooklyn was traditionally one of the most affluent black neighborhoods in the city, but recent statistics have it ranked as one of the most gentrified communities in the country. That change has been marked by black-owned businesses' flight from the area. I spoke with journalist Paul Leonard and Columbia University professor Stacy Sutton, who has studied this trend, about the changing face of the neighborhood. Before that, Abby Ishola tells us about one black-owned business that is still holding out in the neighborhood.
It's been close to 20 years since Michael Thompson opened the Brooklyn Moon Cafe in Fort Greene. His fondest moments of being in business were back in the mid-90s when his restaurant became a hub for poetry readings, plays, and exhibitions for the area's black residents.
But that whole time, it was just like Black Hollywood. A lot of celebrities, actors, artists. Space was very raw, it was broken down, but it was still very charming. I loved it.
Artists like Spike Lee set up shop in Fort Greene in the mid-80s. Other business owners followed suit, helping to change the face of the once drug and crime-infested neighborhood. By the mid-90s, several black-owned clothing stores, antique shops, and restaurants like Brooklyn Moon helped create a sense of community. But in the past 10 years, the area has seen another shift. Today, Fort Greene ranks 6th as one of the most gentrified zip codes in the country. The white population here went from over 19% in 2000 to over 40% in 2010.
Well, it's no longer Black Hollywood. The charm in my eye is pretty much gone. I mean, it's still cool. For me right now, it's just a business, so that's good that, I can separate myself from it. I'm not emotionally attached to the area anymore.
As the area continues to become more gentrified, many of the black businesses that helped revive Fort Greene closed up shop, leaving Thompson as one of the last few standing. The area has now become a haven for multi-million-dollar brownstones, white-owned pubs, organic grocers, and spas. Thompson says some black business owners may have chosen to leave, while others fell victim to rising rents.
I never saw this coming. And when I first saw the first yellow cab come up Fulton Street, it was like seeing a spaceship. It's like, what the? Yeah. That's how different this neighborhood was. I used to know the 2 white families, now I know the 2 black families. Very big change in this neighborhood. And in a very short space of time. 10, 12 years is no time to change a complete neighborhood.
Despite the changes over the years, Thompson says business for him is good. He believes things are about to get even better with the recent opening of the Barclays Arena, home of the Brooklyn Nets.
There's a $1 billion stadium that just opened up down the block, 2 blocks away, and there are 128 shows between now and Christmas. So to me, that's Christmas.
For Independent Sources, Abby Ishola.
Dr. Sutton, just 15 years ago or so, Fort Greene and Clinton Hill had an array of black-owned businesses. What is happening now?
Well, a lot's happening. I think many of the businesses that were there 15 years ago, even 10 years ago, 8 years ago have closed. Many of them have closed, some have relocated, and I think it's fair to say that some new black-owned businesses have opened in recent years, but the proportion of black-owned businesses is significantly less than it used to.
Why? What's going on?
I think a myriad of things. Surely people kind of very quickly describe this as gentrification, and that's part of the processes. But with that, you have to look at the rents and the difficulty of getting a good commercial lease that's affordable for these small businesses. The demographics of the neighborhood have changed, so their primary customer base is different. And what I've learned in doing the research over the years is the relationship between the business owner and the landlord is crucial. So very few businesses in Fort Greene and Clinton Hill actually own the building in which they're operating. And that's kind of customary throughout the city. Very few retailers actually are owners. So the relationship you have with your landlord is central to the types of leases that you're able to negotiate and the terms. And you can't do good business over a kind of a long period of time without a reasonable lease, a 5-year lease that allows you to have that fixed cost. So, the exorbitant rents, it really kind of pushing businesses out. And a lot of landlords are speculating that the rents will even go higher, and they're waiting for kind of more kind of highly capitalized tenants to reoccupy these spaces.
Paul, what role is the new Barclays Center playing in this closing down of small black-owned businesses in Fort Greene and Clinton Hill?
Well, I guess, pardon the pun, it's a game changer. It's really changing the landscape for residents and small business owners. I think that the story about rents in the neighborhood have been fairly well documented, but what I think that people don't realize as much is in terms of our reporting at Patch, just speaking with small business owners, you see that the landlords are reacting to, in the run-up to the opening of the arena, speculation is right. They're speculating that the value of surrounding properties surrounding the arena are going to go up, and that foot traffic is going to increase. There'll just be more bodies in these shops, in these retailers. And you're seeing these leases come up, and they don't come up all at once. That's why you're seeing spotty closures of primarily black-owned businesses throughout the neighborhood. And I think that another problem is that it's not happening all at once. I mean, if your lease happens to end in June of 2012, or if it ends in March of 2013, you just see those landlords going in and asking for more money. And you're seeing more and more small business owners, and historically black Fort Greene, who are just saying it's not worth it anymore.
Are these business owners moving to, let's say, Bed-Stuy, for instance? What's happening to those businesses?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, that's the thing. It's hard to track displaced, right? Those that feel that they've been pushed out, or a number of businesses are frustrated. The ones that I've spoke with over the years have been frustrated and they've closed. Some have relocated, but very few, from my understanding of what's happening in the neighborhood. And in the central Brooklyn more broadly, very few are relocating to another location.
They're just closing their doors.
They're closing their doors. Or, I mean, there's been some really successful businesses that have been incubated in that neighborhood.
Such as
Carol's Daughter, and that their flagship location just closed, but she still has a location in Harlem and in other places. Mashoud in Fort Greene, it opened years ago.
It's
a clothing designer, yeah, from Nigeria. And they have other locations. They're still in Fort Greene, but my point is that we often think of Spike Lee's shop, and
he
closed a long time ago, and he was reoccupied by Carol's Daughter in that same location. But I think the idea that this neighborhood incubated, that notion that it's incubated some really successful businesses, some businesses that have stabilized the neighborhood and supported families, I think gets lost in the ongoing conversation about what's happening. And some of them are not reopening. Some just are not.
Now, Paul, what are some of the businesses who are coming and replacing these black-owned businesses? Evidently, the place is booming, is thriving, so somebody's replacing them, and what is that?
Well, I think that you're seeing definitely a mix. I think that it would be easy to say that a white-owned coffee shop, for instance, would be replacing all of these different places, different kind of businesses. But they tend to be restaurants catering to a different kind of resident. And I don't want to simplify it in terms of race, but I think that it's probably easiest to classify as in terms of being race plus a different income bracket. That's been introduced into the neighborhood. So prices are going up. And I think that these business owners are not raising prices just to raise prices. They are raising prices because the business model has changed for these spaces that they're occupying. These leases are a lot more expensive these days, and they're catering to a different kind of customer.
And Dr. Sutton, if you will, when you look at what's happening there, people are being displaced. What's the community reaction been like?
It's been mixed. Quite honestly, it's somewhat contentious, and it is racialized. There's definitely a class dimension, and so it's really difficult to just kind of simplify this as just race. But it's historically been a very dynamic and predominantly black neighborhood. So what you see, kind of at first glance, is the erosion of this kind of historic black middle-class neighborhood. So I think community residents and many of the business owners were also residents, have been, I think, rightfully kind of a bit disenchanted by the processes, and they feel threatened. And there's been quite a bit of conflict, kind of both in the streets with regard to the Barclays Center, but also other developments over time. This is just kind of where we're thinking about at the moment, but there's a historical trend of change in the neighborhood.
Now, I used to live there, and it had a really cool sense of Black life, and that's missing now. I mean, it's still a great neighborhood. So you were talking about that. Is there any way we can bring some of that back and then give it that sense of, hey, this is part of African-American history?
I think I see a sense of turning the page. I mean, you're certainly definitely, you know, gentrification in Fort Greene has already happened. You know, it's the ship has already left the dock. But you see, and I've noticed it covering things like the Juneteenth Festival, you see that people who are, of color coming in from other places like Georgia, other places in America, other places in Brooklyn like Brownsville and East New York, who are coming to Fort Greene because it's the historic and cultural center of Black life in New York and in a lot of ways in America itself. So I'm seeing that institutions like the Museum of Contemporary African and Diasporan Art, MOCADA, is still there. A lot of their target audience is elsewhere, maybe in Bed-Stuy, maybe in East New York, maybe in Brownsville, otherwise other places in America. But you find that people, Black people, coming to Fort Greene still as a center of Black life. And I think that that presents an opportunity for Black-owned businesses, even though the Black population has gone down in Fort Greene. There's just no arguing that.
Dr. Sutton?
Yeah, no, I think I would agree. I think I take a slightly different position in that, yeah, the institutions that we're talking about, those are relatively new to the area, right? So it's not, you know, I think to understand the trajectory is to really kind of take a step back to the 90s, to the 80s, to the 70s, and that area, even early in the turn of the 20th century, was considered the Black Belt, right? And so there have historically been very strong businesses there. And the museum and Juneteenth, Juneteenth celebration is not new. It's been going on for a number of years in this neighborhood. But the institution that we're referring to as the MOCADA is relatively new. So yes, on one hand, I think it creates opportunities for businesses that can find the capital and to leverage and start, and there would be a market there. But it also limits their, you know, I think when we think about who those business owners might be, the amount of capital that's necessary almost kind of systematically makes Blacks disadvantaged. It doesn't mean that there are not a number of Black people with resources. It's, you know, the structural conditions that create inequality will kind of not necessitate, but they will kind of reproduce these patterns in Fort Greene because it's really difficult to secure a lease.
I think I would have to agree with that. I think it really is an economic problem, and it's going to be a big problem because the really big draw for me, and the reason why I love Fort Greene so much is that diversity. And what we have is a real problem where that diversity is at risk. And I've been covering Fort Greene for about 1.5 years, and that's a relatively short period of time, but I've seen one business after another. These are not just businesses, they kind of almost bleed onto the block. They bleed into the surrounding neighborhood, and there's so much part of what makes Brooklyn, Brooklyn. I mean, I call like Fort Greene the heart of Brooklyn, and I think that that kind of heart is really kind of in danger of becoming something else entirely, something less diverse, less representative of all the people in New York.
Absolutely.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. Dr. Sutton, Paul Leonard, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's our show this week. Thanks for staying tuned. Till next time, be independent-minded.